All right, welcome back, everybody. PayPal and Patreon links are down below if you want to support me. Only do so if you actually can. So, China likes to maintain the image that it is a very efficiently run, non-problem having country. That is really quite the opposite of the case. Some of you may be aware of China constantly buying large amounts of farmland in various other countries, which is in the end a non-solution to their problem, as the countries that farmland is in, but always, and many of them eventually are, going to just not send the stuff to China, with the exception of poorer nations who really need the money, of course. But the reason China is doing this, pursuing this non solution, a sort of desperate attempt to have guaranteed food imports, is because they are rapidly losing and destroying their own farmland, going at a rate of between 2 to 4 million acres of loss per year, dropping from over the last 10 years or so from about 334 million acres of productive farmland down to less than 310 million. And this presents a problem for China, obviously, because they are now food import dependent by a moderate threshold, at least, having to import between 5 to 10% of the food for their population, and in a position of having to increase reliance on imports. So, how did this come about, and why is it continuing? How did they actually dig themselves into this to be grave? Well, you see, if you look at China, you'll find that a huge chunk of it is not arable land of any kind, really. Huge portion is the Himalayas. Another huge portion is the two deserts of Taklamakan and the Gobi Desert. Another fair portion in the south and southwest are regular mountains. So then you have the remaining area of China, which is their only real arable portion, and also happens to be the portion where, because it's best to live there, obviously, compared to the other areas, happens to be the portion where most of their 1.4 billion people live. And so, as China has risen, particularly into the 21st century now, with their mass urban development, they have expanded everything cities, roads, highways, sub cities across that land, gradually, obviously, occupying more and more of it, which you can see if you zoom in on satellite imagery. You can see that quite a bit of that would-be green is gray. So as they continue that expansion now, despite the fact that you may have heard their population has peaked and is now declining, they are actually still continuing their endless construction projects and city building and urban expansion, not for anybody to actually occupy those cities, however. It is a massive government supported real estate Ponzi scheme. Because, like most of the markets, the real estate market is pretty dumb and investors are easily duped. And people are basically just running with slogans, things along the lines of China's where it's at, China's the next big thing. And so, at least up until last year, people in the real estate market from outside of China were constantly always buying up new property within China under the expectations that the value of stuff in China was going to keep going up, without apparently realizing the fact that them constantly buying it, waiting for its value to go up, was the only actual thing constantly pumping its value up, hence it being a Ponzi scheme. And the Chinese government knows that it's a Ponzi scheme, but they have kept it going because their Ponzi real estate market is one of the primary things fueling their GDP, and them constantly ballooning their economic numbers is one of the primary vectors of maintaining support from their public. Obviously, constantly building all of these new properties, all of these basically new entire cities that no one's actually really in. They're just there for real estate investors to buy. Those have to be built on land, which displaces farmland, on top of also all of the mass production that still goes on in China. Despite clear indicators and warnings that you should probably get out, plenty of lower end manufacturers are still doing stuff in China, and although at a decently reduced rate, new factories and such are being built within China, not being retrofit into the now abandoned factories of companies that have left China. They're just new structures and everything, new massive amounts of land being taken up, which is also eaten into their farmland. and also a massively big factor in the loss of their farmland, which the Chinese government nowadays does a very good job of information suppression to keep you from knowing about, is the obscene amount of toxic pollution across various swaths of China, millions of acres of land subject to toxic chemical seepage, acidification from other types of chemical dumping, salination from mass salt runoff, from salting or de-icing of roads in the winter, which is why, as I say during my various live streams a lot, whenever it comes up, spreading traction sand on the roads, like we do up in my home state of Alaska, that is the proper way to handle roads in the winter, not salt. You potentially might be assuming that China in present day is running on better environmental and containment standards than the China of the 1990s and 2000s. And that is incorrect, because then if they started putting those kinds of restrictions on those companies, they would just migrate to other nations that have lax restrictions on them dumping stuff. Now, granted, as I said, quite a number of companies are now starting to leave China, whether that's for a variety of different reasons, like their constant on and off COVID mass shutdowns, CCP's insistence on said companies being subject to their mass surveillance, and also the constant off and on failures of China's power grid because of how horrifically mismanaged their system is. That is also a pretty big factor driving companies out, although many are still there, obviously. And those that were there were dumping stuff and improperly disposing of various chemical wastes. And those that still are there are still doing that. And those who are still entering and going to start stuff in China are still going to do that. As apart from initially back in the 90s when everything started pouring in, aside from initially the cheap labor offer, one of the attractors was completely lax standards of chemical and environmental waste disposal. And so that's gone on for 3+ decades now, and the effects of it are stacking and showing, resulting in now, in just these last 10 years in particular, China dropping from 334 million acres of productive farmland down to now less than 310, with the process not stopping and still ongoing. So we will see how far it goes and how bad it gets over the coming years. But that's it for this one. So thank you everybody for sticking around and listening. Like if you enjoyed, subscribe if you haven't already. PayPal and Patreon links are down there if you want to support me. Only do so if you actually can. Also, go subscribe to my cat's channel. Help us get her up to 1,000 subs and hopefully up to enough watch hours to eventually get her channel monetized. But no matter what happens to me, may God bless and protect all of you, and I will see you all around next time.